World Affairs Roundup, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Doug Savage, Assistant Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM, with the season opener of our World Affairs Roundup. Our panel of Roundup regulars is back to provide their perennially penetrating analysis of recent events on the global stage, including early and often in Afghanistan. Final results of Afghanistan's presidential election have yet to be announced, but the process has already been characterized as deeply flawed. How important is a credible result for U.S. efforts to promote stability in the country? Aso ousted. After 5 decades of political dominance, Japanese Prime Minister Taro Aso's Liberal Democratic Party was handed a crushing defeat in last week's general elections. During the campaign, Yukio Hatayama, leader of the victorious Democratic Party of Japan, criticized Japanese subservience to the U.S. and vowed to pursue a more autonomous foreign policy. What might this mean? Snubbed in Gdansk. European heads of state and other senior officials marked the 70th anniversary of the start of World War II in Gdansk, Poland this week. For many observers in the region, Barack Obama and Hilary Clinton were conspicuous by their absence, fueling feelings that the administration is marginalizing its Central European allies as it tries to court Moscow. Is this keen insight or bruised egos? Gunboat diplomacy? The recent summit of the Union of South American Nations was dominated by debate over Colombia's agreement to allow the American military to use 5 of the country's air bases and 2 naval installations. Is this part of the war on narco-terror or Obama's big stick in Latin America? For a closer look at these stories, we're joined once again by John Katzka, retired U.S. Foreign Service officer who has conducted public diplomacy for the Department of State on 4 continents. Ann Hamilton, political scientist and coordinator of international studies at UW-Whitewater, who also served in the U.S. Foreign Service. And Robert Kraig, author of a number of articles and books dealing with the history and politics of American foreign policy. He currently serves as Director of Program for Citizen Action of Wisconsin. Well, welcome back, everyone. Well, let's start in Afghanistan, if we could. John, maybe you can sort of sketch where we're at right at this point, or to the extent that anyone knows.
Well, clearly we don't know what the results of the election are. The charges are flying fast and furious, but I don't think it's the election that is the important issue in Afghanistan. We tend to use these as markers as to the progress of democratization and stabilization. I think we overuse the mechanism. More important is, where are we in terms of a strategy for Afghanistan? What are our goals there? And I have more questions on this than I have answers. And so as we begin to bring in the troops, do the troops help the situation? I mean, today, just recently, we've had an incident with a airstrike against petro tankers that had been hijacked, and 90 civilians were killed in the process. How much of that kind of collateral damage can we absorb and still be able to keep focused on where we're going in Afghanistan?
But, and, you know, Richard Holbrooke, our special envoy, certainly praised the election, mainly just for having it come off at all. How much U.S. credibility is at stake in this election?
I know that, I believe it was Holbrooke who noted that there are problems in all elections, and he talked about the 7-month process in Minnesota to get a senator, which I thought was pushing the comparison just a little bit, because the levels of fraud that they're talking about, the levels of the number, the great differences in turnout because of intimidation in various areas of Afghanistan mean that the results, whatever they are never going to be representative of what the Afghan people's desires. So, but in terms of stability, I think that one point that's really important is that public opinion in the United States for this war is going down, and going down very fast. And people, including George Will, are now calling for, you know, a reconsideration of this war, our commitment, putting deadlines on having troops there, so that to the extent that allegations of fraud and other problems undermine the legitimacy of the election, it certainly will play into U.S. perceptions and U.S. public opinion, I would argue, about and affect Obama's support, the support for Obama's policies in the war.
Now, Robert, what about just within Afghanistan itself? I mean, can the process of reconstruction and stabilization go forward if whatever result we get from this election is perceived as illegitimate?
I think that's a very important point, because the Obama departure is supposed to be using military force to stabilize it, but then doing an economic reconstruction that makes it a stable country and creates a true multi-ethnic republic of some kind, long-term. And this doesn't help that process at all. It exacerbates ethnic tensions. The two leading contenders are from different ethnicities. And so the Pashtun for Hamid Karzai, and I guess Abdullah is multi-ethnic, but he's considered Tajik. And so this is going to exacerbate those ethnic tensions and probably lead to a great deal more violence. The most violent day of the year in Afghanistan was the election. And so there were a lot of incidents. They're saying it was a victory because only 26 people were killed, which we wouldn't consider a victory most other places in the world, but led to a great deal more terror than that. And so there's a real possibility of a further kind of unwinding of Afghanistan, because the regime is already not highly legitimate and doesn't have a lot of power to project throughout the whole country. And you have this bizarre kind of situation where there was perhaps 60% turnout in the northern provinces and perhaps less than 10% in some of the southern provinces, and those are the parts that are the most unstable and have the most violence. So I think that this calls into question the whole project of getting enough stability to have a reconstruction.
If we can cite Holbrooke again, his ego is everywhere. He also talked about the elections, and he said even if Afghanistan had perfect elections, even if it was a drug-free state and there was no corruption, it would still be unstable. And much of that instability comes from across the border, and we cannot forget Pakistan's role in this, an increasingly larger role as it is attempting to control some of the radical Islamic fundamentalists in its own ranks. And so that you have to really look at this in a larger context of not just what's happening in Afghanistan.
So what are the likely scenarios? I mean, right now, results have not been disclosed in any meaningful way. So what are the possible outcomes of the election, and what would be the sort of best case for the American enterprise there?
Both sides were claiming victory, and if one of them doesn't get 50%, one candidate, then there's supposed to be a runoff in around 8 weeks. And the fear is that there will be much greater instability in that 8-week period, and perhaps a much greater level of violence than we've seen to date. From the U.S. perspective, it would be, I would argue, best if they could resolve it without having to have a runoff. First, that would be the first option. Second option would be to try and do whatever is possible to limit the violence in between the runoff, and try and ensure that the runoff is cleaner, if at all possible. I doubt that it is, than the first round was.
There are people who are saying that what we should be doing is shifting strategy from, instead of nation building, and I keep hearing people talk about rebuilding Afghanistan. I'm not sure what they're talking about rebuilding. I mean, this is, if you're going to, this is a building process. And our historical experience is not particularly good in terms of staying with issues and countries long enough to be able to make a difference. So one of the alternatives is to begin to focus on containing, not eliminating, terrorism within the region and those groups that are involved in terrorism. That's a very different thing than what we've been talking about up to this point. Well,
now I think we should jump to another election with a much more decisive outcome. Robert, sketch out what happened in Japan this week.
Well, there's been one party in control in Japan since 1955, the Liberal Democratic Party, and it was resoundingly defeated by the candidate from the Democratic Party of Japan, and which has run on a very different platform. And so it would seem like a seismic shift in Japanese politics. And the Democratic Party of Japan has also taken a different line towards both China and the United States, and has come out, in fact, very specifically against certain elements of the global economy, talked about working more on the concept of fraternity, where local differences, and specifically hearkening back to the French Revolution and fraternity, I'm not making this up, but also taking out local differences, environmental effects, and just equality, much more economic equality, and arguably tilting more towards China and trying to not do some of the things that the previous party was doing, as far as kind of reawakening the war wounds around what happened during World War II and with the Japanese invasion of China, and going to war memorials that actually are very offensive to the Chinese. And so it would seem like it could be a major departure. It's unclear, since this party has never actually had to have control before and been responsible, what its positions actually will be once it's in power. They've had the luxury for decades of being out of power and therefore not responsible for their positions. And so how sharp a break it's going to be is not clear right now, but it does at least lead to a suggestion that Japan may be trying to build a better relationship with both Korea and China, build on the ASEAN nation kind of regional bloc much more than before. And that could be a change. And he has said specifically, the winner, that the U.S. is losing its power long term and is fading as the dominant power in the world, even though it'll be a couple-decade process. So
ultimately, what does this mean for U.S.-Japanese relations? I mean, is Japan more prominently seeing itself as part of an Asian community a good thing or a bad thing for the U.S.?
I don't think it's a bad thing. I think there's a lot of good in it, actually. I don't think it threatens U.S. relations as much as some of the commentators have said. I think that repairing relations with China, improving relations with China and South Korea in particular, that's a good thing. And I think that the United States has for years nudged Japan, and sometimes done more than nudge it, to take a more assertive role in international affairs, contribute more to, say, its development assistance efforts in South Asia, for example. And so some of it is actually, it's been given a negative twist, but I think a lot of it's quite positive.
Before we get too far ahead in terms of defining what this new party is going to do and this new prime minister, there's a couple of pieces of information that I think pertain. First of all, this party is a collection of a variety of different interests that only purpose to come together was to defeat the LDP. Mm-hmm. The prime minister-elect, if we can call him that, has very negative ratings within the electorate within Japan, and there is there is a negative rating towards many of the parts of the platform that Robert was citing amongst the electorate. So getting too far ahead of this one, we'll have to wait and see. Also, we should remember in terms of China, China is now Japan's _1 trading partner. So it is not a surprising thing that Japan would be courting China.
Right, and its economy is in a mess, so that it's not going to have a lot of latitude.
All right, well, we're going to have to leave Asia there and take a short break. To our viewers, we'll be back in a moment.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus and our World Affairs Roundup. Well, now let's head to Europe and look at the commemoration ceremony for the beginning of World War II in Gdansk, Poland. John, what do you make of the conspicuous absence of high-ranking U.S. officials at this celebration?
It is a puzzle. But I think the first thing we should say is that the ceremony itself was not important. It was more who came and who did not come. And
we should point out, typically it was heads of state.
That's correct. And the key players that did come were obviously the Polish Prime Minister Tusk and the Prime Minister of Russia, Vladimir Putin. And it's curious because it's the Prime Minister as opposed to the President. And recently, Medvedev, the President, had been getting a lot of the show time and camera time around the world. This is Putin pushing himself back into the picture. Also interesting is how this plays out with the U.S. and Poland. I suspect that the viewers are aware that we are now debating whether or not we are going to move forward with a missile defense system in Poland and in the Czech Republic, ideas that had started with the Bush administration, and that these systems are allegedly aimed at a threat from Iran.
Well, and I think we should point out that these systems were typically not particularly popular, so for the Polish government to embrace them was quite a risk for them to take.
Very much so. And I see the decision or the debate about who was going to represent the United States there related to what we would hope to get from Russia in terms of its position vis-a-vis Iran over this the nuclear weapons issues in Iran.
Well, and maybe we could back up a little bit and talk a little bit about the letter that the former heads of state sent in July to President Obama.
Right. There were a number of former heads of state of Central and East European countries and foreign ministers and intellectuals who sent a letter to President Obama expressing their concern about the direction of U.S. foreign policy, and in particular their concern about Obama's overtures and policies with respect to Russia. And they pointed out in the letter that that it was because of the United States that they were now members of NATO, and they gave the United States a lot of credit for the position that they're in today, but also essentially begged the United States to play a larger role in ensuring their security, making it much more important, and in not underestimating the threat that Russia continues to pose. And it was a really interesting letter, and I think that it's interesting because at the time that they brushed over the times that the United States, of course, had not guaranteed their security, like 1956 in Hungary and 1968 in Prague, and all the other times where our biggest concern was the Soviet Union and not East and Central Europe. And so I think that it's their reading of history is, I mean, obviously it's a political letter with a political motivation, but I think that they're putting a gloss on the situation that distorts the historical record a great deal, because we've always paid a lot of attention to Russia, rightfully, and with the Soviet Union as well.
So, Robert, what about that? Do you think that this represents any sort of departure? Are we feeding Central Europe to the Russians?
Well, I wouldn't go that far. It's one of those delicate diplomatic situations. I think the letter is absolutely right that the United States has de-emphasized Central and Eastern Europe because there's been there have been brush fires there, and we tend to go where there are problems, so to speak.
They're also part of the EU now.
Right. Good. So but at the same time, they point out in the letter that NATO seems less formidable than it was when they joined it, and they're not feeling that great security blanket that they hope to feel by joining NATO. And they do have a very large power on their border that is acting erratically at the very least. And I could see from their standpoint, you could see it as aggressive. I mean, from the standpoint of their security. So they'd like to pull the United States back in. The U.S. is trying to take a departure with its relationship with Russia. There are valuable things we could get from better relationship with Russia, like in Iran, as John mentioned, with the nuclear situation there. And there are other things Russia could do for us as well if we had a better relationship. It is a great power still. And so we didn't handle the diplomacy of this very well because we managed to offend some strong allies, but by trying not to offend Russia. And if we could have gotten someone in there higher level than William Perry or General Jones that would have assuaged Central Europe and Poland without offending Russia, that would have been great, but that did not happen. You also have a situation set up where the ballistic missile defense situation has been left by the previous administration. It's strategically silly to put such a thing near Russia at all. It doesn't really protect anyone, but it aggravates Russia a great deal. But now Poland and the Czech Republic will feel like we're pulling back from supporting them if we don't build the darn thing. So I think that that's partly a legacy of the previous administration, but this administration has to figure out how to walk that walk. And we do need to work more with Russia in order to solve a whole lot of other foreign policy problems, but we shouldn't back away from our strong alliance with Central and Eastern Europe.
The whole role of NATO, too, is what's its role. And right now, NATO, the Secretary General, has been tasked with, sort of coming up with a new draft strategic concept that all members of NATO will be discussing, that will look at the whole concept of collective security, its global policy. And all of these countries who are now NATO members will be involved in that discussion.
Overhanging this whole discussion is also energy. And Russia's ability to control energy into that part of the world, and Germany's attention to this, and Poland's. I think in some ways Putin was in Poland to be able to court the Poles because he saw the little bit of a separation between us, the U.S. and Poland, and this was an opportunity for Putin to be able to try and mend some fences there. But good luck on that account.
Yes, I was going to say too.
Well, now let's move on to Latin America. The Union of South American Nations summit this week was dominated by quite a flap over an agreement between Colombia and the U.S. to allow the U.S. military to use bases there. And the Uribe administration in Colombia said this is just part of an ongoing effort against narco-terrorism. It's really nothing new. And some of the more Bolivarian, left-leaning nations in the region said, no, this is the return of the big stick, and it's the Yankees coming back, and they'll soon be spilling over the border of Colombia. So, first of all, how significant is this? And anyway,
I was in Peru this summer for 3 weeks, and what they continually emphasized are the tremendous divisions in Latin America, and spoke of them, in South America I should say, and spoke of them as relatively new, at least the intensity of them. While there have long been difficult relations between certain countries, before they were divided, united in their opposition to the United States, and now they're really, really divided with the Bolivarians against, and then the group in the middle, Brazil, sometimes Argentina, and then you have the group on the right, and they call it the neoliberals versus the anti-neoliberals. But they're very emphatic about this.
Trying to wrap my mind around that one.
And but what is really interesting about this is instead of bringing the continent together, as you might expect, it split them further apart. And they do have these very serious differences. And Colombia is really, there are pictures in the newspapers when I was down there of FARC representatives giving money to Correa, who's the president of Ecuador, in his presidential campaign. And of course, there's been the Colombians chasing going across the border to chase FARC, their their
bases.
Their bases and all that are over there, and all sorts of people saying that this is really not just Latin America. It's Cuba that's funding all of this through Venezuela and Iran. So there's all this conspiracy. I mean, I don't know whether it's conspiracy or not, but it's created tremendous divisions there. And I think that this is just we've been supporting Colombia for so long with military equipment that there is the whole sovereignty issue. But I think they're picking up on this, and it's just they're using it to exacerbate all of the terrible divisions that there are right there right now. I don't think it's the return of the big stick.
Okay.
In answer to your question.
We've got just about a minute left. So what do you think the administration's intentions are in the region? Either one of you.
Well, I think, like the previous topic, they mishandled this diplomatically, because if you look at what Brazil's reaction is, and some of the quote-unquote moderates in South America, they all thought this was a terrible idea just to have this use of 5 Air Force bases and 2 naval bases in perpetuity just sprung on everyone. So it was badly handled, and it's damaged the capacity to deal with the emerging South American economic powers, especially Brazil. And so it's interesting. It's kind of a continuity over what's happened the last 8 years at least in American foreign policy in South America.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it at that. To our panel, welcome back, and thank you for a good opening. To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,